They shoved him into a concrete room and called it a test. 3 bruised men with prison-bred cruelty, convinced a laugh can be broken the same way a bone can. The lights flickered like guilty thoughts. The air tasted of sweat and cheap coffee. He sat with his hands folded, eyes like a coin you can't read, and when one of them spat, "We'll take everything from you," the room only leaned in, hungry for the sound of a collapse that never came. Because the thing they didn't understand was simple. He had already been broken, rebuilt, and rewritten. His calm wasn't the absence of fear, it was a map of all the ways people had failed him and a patient list of debts they didn't know they'd incurred. When he smiled, it wasn't madness, it was calculation. When he listened, it was a man learning the names of his enemies. Subscribe now to witness a story where revenge feels like justice, where the hunted becomes the only shelter left. Turn on notifications. This is one journey you don't want to miss. He let them circle him like wolves, too polite to show their teeth at first. Small tests, bruises traded like currency, words sharpened into knives. The concrete room smelled of iron and stale breath. A single fluorescent light hummed above, painting everything the color of nerves. They believed breaking a laugh was a matter of force. Loud insults, sudden slaps, the slow, practiced humiliation of a man stripped to his worst memory. "We'll take everything from you," one of them said, voice flat as a razor. They expected a howl. They got a quiet look, and that silence was worse than any scream. They started with jokes, cruel, personal, the sort that hunt for the exact place a person is raw. But he answered with stories, small and improbable, the kind of nonsense that made them blink and lean in. "My mother used to tell me the moon was only a light on a stage," he said once, voice low. "She lied to me because she wanted me to sleep." The cellmates laughed at first, a reflexive, hungry sound, then stopped when they realized his calm was a weapon. Listening, he mapped them. Who remembered a face from the yard? Who feared a guard's boot on their neck? Who had a sister with a debt? He learned names like a man learning the layout of a city he intends to burn and rebuild in his own image. They tried every trick. They baited him with shame, with sympathy, with the promise of release if he cooperated. They mocked the absence of a moral compass, the missing anchor that had made him what he'd become. He let them. Sometimes his face would fold into something fragile, sometimes a laugh would escape, a small thing like a moth hitting glass. Each time he collected a piece of them in return, an old habit, a fear, a secret, little keys for doors he had not yet found. What they could not see was the ledger he kept in his head. Debts owed to those who'd built a life on other people's ruins. Corruption had teeth with gold fillings. Betrayal wore a suit and smiled from behind a podium. He had been broken like a child's toy, then put back together with different screws. His revenge was not a riot of fireworks, but a slow, inevitable recalculation. He watched the wardens and their neat reports, the lawyers who promised safety in exchange for silence. He watched the patterns, who arrived with clean hands and who left with pockets full. Days bled into nights with care and caution. The cellmates grew bolder as their taunts failed, and with boldness came violence. A night kicked off by a careless guard, a punch that opened a wound. That was the moment one of them, a broad-shouldered man named Reese, made the mistake of asking too loudly, "Who are you, really?" The answer came like a confession that couldn't be contained. He told them a story, not all of it true, perhaps none of it exactly, but true enough. He told them about a courtroom that smelled like lemon and victory, about papers that disappeared from files, about a boy who died with a name no one remembered. He spoke of the men who called brutality justice, and of the polite hands that signed off on it. "What you do out there matters," he said quietly, leaning in until the fluorescent light carved his cheekbones into the shadow of a grin. "You live in a world where tomorrow happens because people made a calculation today. I just changed the math." That evening, the prison woke to a rumor, like a warning bell. A gang from the South Block had been promised a list, names to settle old scores. The 3 cellmates who had been so eager to break him found themselves pacing, voices thin, with a fear they'd never shown. They asked the same question, different ways. "Who's this list from? Who wants us dead?" He watched their bravados deflate, the way mice become small when the owls begin to circle. He could have sat back and watched them tear each other apart. He had the appetite for it. Instead, he spoke in a voice that folded them like a hand into a glove. "You want protection," he said. "You want a body between you and the storm. Fine, I'll shelter you, but shelter is not free." They laughed at first, then begged. The very men who had spit at him and called him a monster now crawled to the edge of his small bed, palms out, pleading like children in a church. Their arrogance had died on the same night as their certainty. "Please," Reese said, voice cracking, keep us safe. We'll do anything." He listened, and in their pleading he smelled the same thing he'd always smelled in the mouths of judges and ministers and men with clean hands: fear. Fear made people honest. It made them small and manageable. He agreed to protect them, but not because mercy had changed his bones. Protection for him was another lever. If he saved them, they would owe him not just gratitude, but a silence and a favor, a future coin he could spend. It was tidy, it was surgical, it was cruel and efficient. "You'll have my protection," he said, smiling in a way that showed too many teeth. "But when the time comes, you will speak my name at the right moment. And when you do, we'll see what weight a promise has." They nodded like men released from a hallucination. Relief, immediate, animal, unknotted shoulders and cleared throats. Outside, footsteps moved with a new purpose. Something had shifted in the prison's air. He leaned back against the wall, eyes closing, a man who believed himself the only honest ledger in a city of forged signatures. Then, as the door clicked and the corridor beyond filled with the distant shuffle of boots, one of the cellmates, quiet, pale, the least noticed, whispered, "You know who signed my pardon papers 10 years ago." His voice was small, but it struck a chord like a bell. The others stilled. The name that followed was not random. It was the name of a man who had once sat behind a dais and smiled while sending boys to places where laughter didn't survive. The room seemed to contract. He smiled, not the cruel grin they'd expected, but the look of a man completing a circle. "I know," he said, "and you will be safe, for now." Outside the door, boots ended their march, and in the space that followed, a different sound came. A single, deliberate knock, as if someone had just arrived to collect on a debt no one in that corridor dared to acknowledge. The knock came again, softer this time, like someone tapping a rhythm only guilt could hear. The corridor beyond the cell shivered with voices, not the rough laughter of prisoners, but the clipped, practiced cadence of men who spent their lives polishing reputations. When the door opened, the man who stepped in wore a suit as if it were armor. His smile was the kind of thing that had sent boys to places where no one came back the same. Carrington. The name tasted like lemon and paper, an old promise notarized and then ignored. They met in the visiting room, the air thick with the expectation of an execution rather than a conversation. Guards stood with bored discipline at the edges, their eyes flicking like flies between Joker and the man who had once signed pardons with the same hand he used to sign campaign checks. "You brought me a miracle," Carrington said, voice silk over iron. "I thought you'd rot quietly." Joker folded his hands on the table and stared at him as if he were a photograph that had been left too long in the sun. "Miracles are expensive," he said, "and they're seldom free of stains." Carrington laughed and leaned back, certain. "You think you can bargain with me? You think you have leverage?" He did not answer the question the way Carrington liked. He told a story instead, one of small things no man in a suit remembers. The way a mother waited in a hallway and learned to pretend the phone call would always bring good news. The shape of a boy's shoes after they had been left in the rain. He spoke names, not like a man reciting a list, but like a man giving eulogies to parts of a city that had been buried alive. He described the rooms Carrington never visited, the quiet offices where decisions were folded into paper and shipped out like contraband. Carrington's smile showed a crack. "You're mad," he said. "You'll die for this." "Maybe," Joker said, "or maybe I'll make you die for it." Outside, the prison hummed with 1,000 small refusals, a bathroom that wouldn't flush, a light that flicked at the right moment, a line of men at the bars who, when they turned their faces, looked less like prisoners and more like witnesses. Joker had not come alone. He had collected debts in the way a winter collects snow, quietly, inevitably. The cellmates who once tried to break him now sat behind thick glass, pale and trembling, their faces catalogued like evidence of how fear reshapes a man. "You want them safe," Carrington said, voice low. "You can buy safety. You can cut deals. There are people who will—" "No," Joker interrupted. "Deals are for people like you. I don't buy safety. I sell truth." He smiled then, but it was not a grin so much as a baring of teeth in a man's mouth who'd been laughing at the wrong joke for too long. "Get up," he told Reese's broad shoulders. "Tell them." Reese blinked as if waking from a dream. He walked to the glass and with a voice that scraped like a rusty hinge began to speak. Not pleading, not cowed, but precise. He told of nights where warrants were creative with the law, where boys were moved like chess pieces, where a signature cleared more than a conscience. One by one, the men behind the bars stepped forward. They had been given a currency, protection, in exchange for truth. They paid. Carrington's hands trembled where they folded. He tried to interrupt, to wave a hand and order the guards, to call a lawyer who could stitch his name back into a safe place. But the room had shifted. Those who once scorned the idea of the underclass now held the power to speak in places where paper alone did not bind fate. At a dozen voices, then 30, then a chorus told small, awful things. There was no flashing evidence, no neat confession on a screen, only the long, corrosive weight of 1,000 tiny truths, each one a drop of acid on polished brass. "You think this will end me?" Carrington asked, a note of actual fear now in his tone. "I can buy silence. I can make them disappear." Joker leaned forward so that the fluorescent light carved a canyon down his face. "You always thought you were the only one who could buy people," he said. "You forgot about what happens when someone sells the idea of being unbuyable." The guards hesitated, citations of procedure popping up like weeds in summer. In that pause, the least noticed of the cellmates, the pale man who had whispered the name days before, stepped forward and put both hands on the glass. His face was small, with a kind of terrible clarity, like someone who'd finally figured how to say his own name. "I signed a paper for your son once," he said. "You said it would fix things. I believed you." He spat, and the sound landed like a bell. Carrington's mask broke all at once. He lunged toward the door as if a bolt could change something written in years. Guards caught him, then another thing happened. The prison's warden, a clean man who owed his post to the very network Carrington had built, walked in with an envelope and a pair of hands that could not hide they were bribed. He had a choice, to lock the mouths of the men and preserve the ledger, or to listen. He looked at the faces around the table and then at Joker. "You could walk away," Carrington hissed. "You could make me offer—" Joker stood and smiled, slow and patient and terrible. "I already paid for what I wanted," he said, "with what I have left." He reached into his coat as if to take out a thing, then paused. "But if you want something fair, here it is. I will take the blame for all the chaos I caused to get you here. I will be the monster in their stories if they will be the men in theirs." Silence fell like snowfall. The guards exchanged looks. The warden swallowed. Carrington's eyes widened, not in defeat, but in the recognition of a currency he had never considered. Sacrifice. "You'd save them by burning yourself?" Carrington said, incredulous. "Sometimes the only way to teach a city mercy is to show it the cost of silence." Joker replied, "I will be the confession that makes your name seem small." He turned to the men who had once spat on him. "You will be free. Speak truth, and you will be untouchable because you'll no longer be alone." The twist came not in a gunshot or a gavel, but in a small, impossible moment of choice. Carrington laughed then, not the triumphant man, but the man who knew he had been stripped of excuses. He signed something on a paper the warden brought. It was not a pardon, not quite, but a promise written by men who suddenly feared what their hands had done. Guards looked away as Reed and the others were led to a cavern of bureaucracy that would either keep them safe or grind them into new shapes. Joker watched them go, eyes softening in a way that hurt like sunlight. As the door closed behind the last set of pleading hands, he turned to Carrington and smiled once more. "You taught a city how to laugh at its broken," he said, voice low. "I taught it to listen." They led him away, not as a free man, but as a story that would be told at kitchen tables and public squares. He could have raged. He could have railed. Instead, he laughed once, a small, weary sound like a match struck in the dark, and the world leaned in. Later, when the paperwork was quiet and the city began to bob in its new, uneasy water, someone would come to the cell to find it empty. On the concrete bed lay a single scrap of paper with 4 words scrawled in a looping hand. "I did what I could." Was it martyrdom, strategy, or something uglier and truer? The men who had begged for his protection did not know. They only knew they had been given a strange, terrible gift, a chance to wake up and be other than what they had been. Outside the walls, life went on. Judges argued, men smiled from podiums, and children laughed without knowing why their world had shifted. But somewhere, in the space where guilt meets grace, a man with a painted face had traded himself for a ledger balanced on the bones of the city. The question he left behind sang louder than any confession. Who had truly been protected that night? The men he sheltered, or the conscience of a place that had forgotten how to keep one? They said he vanished the way some men die, quietly, without permission, leaving behind a space that refuses to close. The cell was empty, the bed bare, the walls still carrying the echo of a laugh that no one could prove they'd heard. Guards swore they'd checked every corridor. The warden swore nothing like that could happen without help. The city swore it didn't care. And yet, in the days that followed, something in the air felt rearranged, like furniture moved in the dark. Reese and the others were transferred under layers of caution that tasted like panic. They walked straighter now, eyes up, as if shame had finally learned to loosen its grip. When they spoke, people listened, not because they were clean, but because they were no longer pretending to be. Deals collapsed in quiet rooms. Men who once shook hands across polished tables found their smiles stiffening, their calendars filling with meetings that ended early. No one said his name aloud. They didn't have to. It was there, hovering, a grin carved into the margins of every conversation. At night, Reese dreamed of the cell, of the way protection had felt like a hand on the back, firm and impersonal, of the bargain he hadn't known he was making, not for safety, but for the right to wake up without lying to himself. He told a guard once, voice low and hoarse, "He didn't save us. He dared us." The guard laughed it off. The guard had not seen the way men flinched when the lights flickered. Across the city, Carrington learned the cost of a life spent believing you could buy silence. Invitations thinned. Friends forgot to return calls. Old allies suddenly remembered rules. He sat alone in a room with too much glass and not enough shadows, listening to the tick of a clock that had learned how to mock him. He told himself the storm would pass. Storms always did. But this wasn't weather. This was erosion. 1,000 small truths rubbing away at a monument that had never learned to be humble. In a diner on the edge of town, a waitress noticed a man who never ordered food, only coffee, only once a day, always at the same table. He had a face that seemed both familiar and wrong, like a photograph developed from memory. He tipped too much and smiled as if the smile were a promise he'd broken. When the news played on the small television above the counter, hearings, resignations, apologies that sounded like rehearsals, he laughed softly into his cup. Not triumph, recognition. He listened. He always listened. He listened to the way the city tried to narrate itself back into innocence. He listened to the stories people told when they thought no one important was around. He listened for the shape of fear changing. Once, a man in a jacket sat across from him and said, "You know, they say it was him, the clown." The man with the coffee tilted his head. "They say a lot of things," he replied, and the conversation ended the way so many did, with the uneasy sense that something had been said too late. Weeks passed. The myth grew legs and walked. Some said he'd escaped with help. Some said he'd never been there at all. Some said he'd died smiling, finally satisfied. The truth, like all good truths, refused to sit still. In a quiet church with peeling paint, a woman lit a candle for a son whose name had once been a footnote. She didn't know why the weight in her chest felt lighter. She didn't know who to thank. She only knew that for the first time in years, the silence felt less like an accusation. Then came the night the city's lights went out. Not all at once, not dramatically, but in a staggered pattern that made people look up from their phones and feel small. In the darkness, voices carried. People stood on stoops and in doorways, sharing rumors like bread. On a bridge, a figure leaned against the rail, watching the water catch what little light remained. He hummed a tune that had no words, the kind you make up when you don't want to be alone with your thoughts. A young man approached him, breath shallow, eyes darting. Are you him?" he asked, hating himself for asking. The figure did not turn. "I'm a man who likes bridges," he said. "They remind you that something can connect even when it looks like it shouldn't." The young man swallowed. "They say you protect people." The laugh that followed was almost gentle. "No," the figure said. "I protect moments." He finally turned, and the streetlight caught the edge of paint that didn't belong to a costume so much as a memory. People have to decide what to do with them. Sirens wailed in the distance. Not for him, not this time. The young man stepped back, heart hammering. "What do you want?" he asked. And the answer came with a shrug that felt like a benediction and a curse. "Balance," the figure said, "and a city that doesn't confuse quiet with clean." By morning, the lights returned. The bridge was empty. In a courthouse office, a clerk found a note tucked into a book no one had opened in years. It wasn't a threat or a confession. It was a question, written in looping ink. If protection costs nothing, why does it never last? The clerk stared at it, then closed the book with a hand that trembled. They never caught him. Or maybe they did, and it just didn't matter. What mattered was the way men hesitated before signing their names. The way cellmates slept lighter, knowing the bargain they'd made had teeth. The way a city learned, slowly and painfully, that monsters are often born where accountability goes to die. And that sometimes the most dangerous thing a man can do is refuse to disappear quietly. Some nights, when the wind is right, people swear they hear a laugh from somewhere it shouldn't be. Not mocking, not mad, just amused, like a man watching a careful plan unfold. And in that sound is the final twist no one can prove or deny. That he never wanted to be a hero at all, only a mirror held steady long enough for the city to recognize itself and decide whether it could live with what it saw. Some stories don't end, they linger. If this one stayed with you, if it made you question who the real villain is, then the Joker did his job. Like, subscribe, and stay close, because the next story won't ask for your attention. It'll take it.